Good afternoon. Today we'll be discussing the book Trauma Responsive Schooling, Centering Student Voice in Healing. Please note that chat is disabled for attendees. However, you may enter your questions into the Q&A feature, which will be active throughout the event. Richard Weisbord will introduce our authors shortly. Rick is Senior Lecturer on Education at HGSE and at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he's also Director of the Making Caring Common project. I would like to pass it over to Rick now.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for your interest in this terrifically important topic. And I'm delighted to have two of our three speakers here. Lynn McHale-Brown is not able to join us today because of a death in the family, so we will miss her. But her partner, Mark Tappan, is here, and Catherine Biddle is here, and we will love to hear from them. I have known Lynn and Mark for many, many years, I think since grad school. So it's almost 35 or 40 years, and it's been a great pleasure. Mark does wonderful work on masculine identities, healthy masculine identities. He runs the Healthy Masculine Identity Project. He's done wonderful work in moral development, pioneering work on a narrative approach to moral development. So I'm excited to have him here. I'm excited to hear about his new work on trauma responsive schools. Catherine Biddle, I am just meeting, but she is a professor, associate professor of ed leadership at the University of Maine, and also a co-author on this book. And we are delighted to have her here as well. And I'm going to turn it over to them. Thank you so much for being here.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Rick. I'm going to share my screen and make sure everything is working on this. Great. Looking good from folks, Rick and others. Oh, good. Okay, wonderful. Well, yeah, thanks for the opportunity to be here. Yeah, nice to see you, Rick, again. Gutman has a very special place in my heart. Spent many hours there back in the day. When I was at the ed school. So it's great to take part in this. And again, Lynn sends her best wishes and regards, but she's dealing with other issues. So Kat and I are here, and we have been working together for the past 6 years. It really has been a kind of change of direction for me, but it's been a wonderful, wonderful opportunity, and we're looking forward to sharing our work with you all and engaging in conversation. So you all know that student needs for kind of emotional support are off the charts these days. This disruption of the past 2 years has been incredibly challenging. Lots of statistics are out there, including the sad figure that, almost 200,000 young people have lost one or more caregivers. And young people reporting that they matter in their communities is as low as 50%. And so as people who care about children and youth, we have our work cut out for us. And we're hoping that this book and the work that we've been doing together in rural schools in Maine, offers something to the conversation. So just as a beginning place to start, just ask everyone to take a moment and just think about a time that an adult really listened to you when it mattered. And just take a moment, who was that person? What was the situation? What did that feel like? A time that an adult really listened to you and it mattered. I don't know if we have the facility for people to chime in and share quick excerpts or not, quick responses to this or not. Let's just maybe give a moment. I'm not sure if we can do that.
Yes, I can enable chat.
Or chat would be great, or even a individual response really quickly from a couple of folks. Okay, well, let's leave that open as a possibility to put in the chat, and we'll move on in the interest of time. So our agenda today is to talk about why centering student voice is key to effective trauma responsive and equitable schooling. That's really our kind of primary takeaway, if you will. We want to share some on-the-ground examples of how centering student voice in the schools we worked with leads to equity, deeper social emotional learning, and more effective healing. And lastly, if we have time, we want to leave you with some concrete strategies that those of you who are working in schools or headed off to work in schools that you can use to build momentum for centering students and moving towards equitable healing environments in your schools and your classrooms. So first, my job is to talk a little bit about student voice and why student voice is the key and why we really, this is the place to start. So again, we live in a world where the importance of supporting students who have experienced adversity, toxic stress, and trauma, it's been a growing concern over a number of years, and it's even more so as a result of the pandemic. And inequity, injustice, unfairness, specifically the unfair distribution of access to resources and opportunities that lead to outcome disparities that are predictable by race, socioeconomic status, gender identity, home language, and other dimensions of identity, has also been a central concern for schools and communities, and again, even more so as a result of the pandemic. So, we think about these as intersecting issues, systemic and structural inequities, such as racism, homophobia, transphobia in schools and society are traumatizing. And so they contribute and build on each other. So we take away from this kind of understanding that we can't just focus on the individual level, what happens to kids growing up. We also have to focus on and work to change institutional, systemic, and structural oppression and inequities and how these negatively impact kids in school. Quick shout, highly recommend Paul Gorski's work on reaching and teaching students in poverty and his work on equity literacy, and a new book. Paul's book's been out for a while. It's in its second edition. A new book by Alex Chevron-Vinay on equity-centered trauma-informed education. That's just been out about a year. Alex does her work in Vermont, and really, both of these authors have been influential in our own work, and we really recommend them to you all. Taking from Gorski the notion and the concern about deficit ideology and the worry about that, and the understanding of how harmful deficit ideology is, the tendency to focus on people's weaknesses, what they lack rather than their strengths, based on stereotypes and biases, ignoring barriers and challenges and inequities, and justifying perpetuation of privilege and kind of applying a blame to the victim mentality. Both trauma and inequity really, there's a kind of very slippery slope towards a deficit ideology, and both are susceptible to deficit thinking. So this is particularly true in trauma, where thinking about trauma, thinking about the long-term emotional, psychological, and physical consequences, can just lead one to frame trauma, the impact of trauma, the kids who have experienced trauma in very deficit terms. And we really, one of our key assumptions is we have to avoid focusing only on the negative impact of trauma on individual kids, the negative impact on executive functioning, SEL, et cetera. And we have to avoid the impulse to blame parents or families and simply to fix kids. Another very influential author in our work, highly recommended if you don't know the work of Elizabeth Dutrow, who says that in her book, The Vulnerable Heart of Literacy, she describes trauma as both ubiquitous in its use and highly ambiguous. So healing, she says, requires both a critical lens, quoting her, the necessary work of questioning what is meant by the term trauma, and a kind of tenderness, openness, and flexibility that unsettles traditional schooling. So becoming a trauma responsive school is not an easy or a straightforward task. And certainly that's a lesson we've learned in our work. Just a quick example of the relationship between, sort of the deficit susceptibility thinking that's embedded in the current thinking about the relationship between SEL or social emotional learning and trauma responsive education. There's kind of a taken for granted assumption that SEL means trauma responsive. There are lots of sort of off-the-shelf packaged SEL programs. Some of you may be familiar with them that really, lead with the idea of fixing kids. They do so without looking critically at school culture, relationships, policies, and the environment. Just heard last week of an example where a school district, as part of their disciplinary program, was requiring students to participate or go through an SEL training. So, it's being used also in a kind of punitive way. And we have a different understanding of social emotional learning that we'll be sharing as we move forward. Just quickly, this from Gorski's outlined this in great detail. Inequity also is very susceptible to deficit thinking. And the kind of the assumptions, the kind of stereotypical assumptions on the left-hand side, all locate the problem of inequity and disadvantage in the individual rather than in the distribution of resources, opportunities, policies, and practices that are in the wider world. We absolutely kind of subscribe to Gorski's injunction that you have to fix injustice and not kids. Believe that genuinely trauma responsive and equitable efforts never focus on simply adjusting the cultures, mindsets, values, emotions, or attitudes of people from marginalized groups. They always focus on transforming conditions that disadvantage or oppress folks from marginalized groups. So that brings us to student voice and our fundamental assumption that kind of feeling empowered changes how young people are regarded and treated by peers and adults. There's lots of work out there and by lots of different folks sort of making this point, illustrating how promoting student voice, student empowerment reduces school alienation, allows students to experience what it feels like to be taken seriously, as well as to educate and influence others. Just one example, the work of Mira Levinson, right at the Ed School there, her book, No Citizen Left Behind, is a great example of the power of centering student voice, the importance of engaging with students as full and active partners in school, as citizens. Work requires mutual relationships, genuine listening in so-called relationship-rich environments, and lots of good things come out of efforts to promote student voice. Increasing autonomy, control, self-efficacy, and competence, feelings of trust and belonging are just examples of that. So we think that promoting student voice is one way to ditch deficit thinking, a key way to move beyond deficit thinking, focusing on strength, recognizing the role that students play in their own healing, enhancing equity by increasing access to resources and opportunities, and empowering students to become activists and change agents in their schools and communities. There's support for sort of this view comes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services, SAMHSA. Some of you may be quite familiar with SAMHSA's principles for trauma responsive care. The SAMHSA focuses on 6 principles that they identify as being key to trauma responsive environments across lots of different sectors. And what we have observed is that many schools, when they start to undertake this work, start in a different place. They start with safety. How can we create safer environments? However, we really believe, and our work shows, that it's really impossible to answer that question without centering the much harder to enact principles of voice, empowerment, and equity. So we've got a different vision of the relationship between those 6 principles that centers voice, empowerment, and equity, and that doing that leads to safety, leads to trustworthiness and transparency, direct connection to collaboration and mutuality, and as well as empathy and collective well-being. So the book is of our work, and Kat's going to, in a minute, take us through much more detail of kind of where we worked and what we did, and ultimately what we're reporting on. But we had this sort of general hypothesis, if you will, going in, or hunch, that centering student voice and equity will result in more effective trauma responsive practices in specifically rural schools and communities. And so among our questions are these 3. What is the impact on student outcomes when student voice and equity are prioritized in trauma responsive education? What's the impact on school climate prioritized in trauma responsive educational practice? And what are some effective practices for centering student voice in trauma responsive schools and communities? So turn things over to Kat.
Thanks for that great introduction of the work, Mark. So at this point, you might be wondering, what is it that we actually did? How do we go about investigating these questions? And so, Mark, if you can go to the next slide. One of the things, so the way that this work kind of came about was there was a community or a region in Maine that was really, really interested in collectively approaching this work. And there was a nonprofit organization that convened a kind of working group that was made up of diverse stakeholders to really think about how to enact a trauma responsive educational model that would work for rural schools. Because at that moment in time, back in the early 2010s, when they were just beginning to think about this, there were not existing models of trauma responsive practice that were really designed with the unique organizational and community arrays of assets of rural places in mind. And so as part of that, Mark and Lynn and I were invited along with other faculty at our institutions into this work. And we went through a kind of several design processes to think about what a model like this could look like. And we're lucky enough to receive some funding to help put those models into practice. And these models were designed in partnership with teachers and with other stakeholders in the community. Because the idea was, and I think this was one of the foundational assumptions that I'll talk about in a second, that we didn't want to do work to schools, but rather with schools. So the trauma responsive equitable education became the name of the project. And there were a variety of, there's a director and some staff members who were placed in schools to work in partnership with them. And so, well, we had a number of schools that we work with. The ones that we talk about in the book are 2 rural remote schools, elementary K through 8 schools that we've called Portside and Seabrook. Each school had about 100 students, so pretty small schools, but typical for rural remote communities. And one of the communities was home to a new immigrant population that came to work in the blueberry fields, among other industries. Next slide, Mark. So the way that we worked, we think is really important in terms of how we developed the practices that we're going to talk about today. So we worked in research practice partnership. We met as a team, the practice side of the partnership and the research side of the partnership every week for an hour and a half to talk about different practices that were getting pioneered. And we worked to ramp up the things that were working well and then sunset the things that were not working as well. And we were really lucky to work with some very committed school partners who let us try out a lot of different kinds of things, and a lot of teachers who are really game to put these practices into effect in their classrooms. So we think that there were unique strengths that each side of the partnership brought. And through that, we were able to come up with these sets of practices that have the effects that we're going to talk about. Mark, can you go to the next slide? But all of this work proceeded from a couple of key assumptions that we negotiated in the context of the community organizing that was done by this nonprofit organization and this diverse stakeholder group that convened to think about these things. So the first of these was that rural communities are powerful allies in creating healthy ecologies for youth, and communities already engage in many of the practices that support positive youth development. So really resisting that deficit narrative that gets put onto rural people and places around what they're able to offer young people and what they are like as communities. The other deficit narrative that we tried to resist was that teachers, we assumed that teachers were knowledgeable professionals who are doing their best within a context of fiscal constraint and accountability policies. So it's not that teachers weren't doing their jobs or weren't coming through for kids. I mean, I think one of the big things is we're like, no teacher gets up in the morning and thinks, how am I going to ruin a child's development today? So, really thinking about the structures that keep teachers from doing the best kind of work that they can do, and to really thinking about skill development from that lens as well. And so creating PD that empowers rather than focuses on deficit. We talked about how service delivery should focus on amplifying rural community and school assets, while also identifying ways to overcome challenges that were fostered by distance and economic marginalization and structural or historical racism. So thinking about the inequities that occur within communities and between communities. And then also recognizing that one of the narratives that's persistent about rural places is that they don't have the people that they need to do the work that they need to do. And so we thought, we just decided to reject that wholesale and say the people who we need to do this work are already in these communities. And it's more about leveraging and giving them a platform and the resources to do that work than bringing people in from the outside. So leveraging the unique localized expertise to bolster the sustenance of healthy developmental ecologies for young people. Next slide, please. So over the course of the time that we were completing this project, and really this says 2017, but the community work had been happening since 2012. 2015 is when we joined the project, and there were 2 planning years ahead of actually starting any work in partnership with the schools and classrooms. But when we did start work, we looked at we collected 2 different types of data. We looked at quantitative outcome measures, and we used a variety of instruments to look at change. So attitudes toward trauma-informed care, the developmental assets profile, and basic psychological needs assessment. We did a school climate survey that was actually led by young people. And we also looked at school-based data. And then every year, twice a year, we started with baseline focus groups with teachers, students, and parents. We interviewed teachers, students, and parents 2 times a year. We put GoPro cameras on students for some of the different activities that we did to really get a sense of what their experience was from their perspective. And then we also there were mental health providers that were a part of this project, and they provided written reports. The staff from TREE provided written reports. And then obviously we had our weekly meetings where we worked in partnership. So you might be wondering at this point, okay, but what did you guys actually do in the schools? Next slide, Mark. So there were 4 key practices. There were lots of things that we did, but there were 4 key practices that focused around the student empowered social emotional learning piece, which is what we kind of called the work of centering students as a trauma-informed practice. And so we started, so these are arrayed in terms of the level of investment that they required from the school in order to enact them. So at the top, we have Some Days, which was a high visibility practice with immediate impact that touched every child and teacher in the school right away, but was relatively low in terms of the cost of doing it in terms of effort. And so that's that was sort of one of the introductory practices. And then from that, we were able to, once we had investment in the in listening to students in a new kind of way, we were able to enact micro adventures, which I'll talk about in a second, with some of the older grades, and then moving stories with some of the younger grades. And again, I'm going to talk about what those 2 things are. And then finally, the last practice, which we consider to be kind of the highest investment practice, was students leading curricular change and pedagogical change within their school, and connected to school climate reform. So I'll talk about each of these in turn, and we go through these in the book. So the first practice that we pioneered to introduce the idea of legitimating the desires and interests of young people was this idea of Some Days. And so every child and every teacher in the school was invited to complete this sentence. Someday in school, I'd like to blank. And so for a second, I would like you all to just think about how you would answer that question, or how you might expect your kids to answer, or how you might expect youth you know to answer. Okay, Mark, can I have the next slide? So one of the things that happens when you invite young people to share their expertise on their own experience is that adults sometimes get a little bit uncomfortable. And so one of the things that we heard when we started doing this is, well, kids are going to ask for things that we can't give them, or they're going to ask for things that are completely unreasonable. And one of the things that I think everyone was surprised by was how modest and achievable the things that young people asked for as a result of this were. And so every day for the rest of the school year, the tree staff and the teachers in the school went about making one young person and one teacher's someday happen. And so every day was a new person's someday, and it was posted right at the front of the school when you walked in. Today is so-and-so's someday. And the things that young people asked for were really diverse. So some young people wanted to teach kindergarten. Some people wanted to, there was a girl who had a cousin, she was in 4th grade and her cousin was in 2nd grade, and they never got to have recess together. So she said, can we please have recess together one day so I can see my cousin? There was another boy who wanted to sit in the principal's chair and eat M&Ms while he chatted with the principal. And then, there were other some days that really got to the heart of, thinking about community well-being, right? So one person wanted everyone to start the 3rd quarter with an 100 in the grade book so that everybody could feel successful for one day. Or another person wanted to have a glow-in-the-dark sock hop in the gym. So the someday that is pictured here on this slide is from a young woman named Valerie. And Valerie is an interesting case because she wanted to teach kindergarten, and they made snow using baking soda and shaving cream outside on the school picnic tables. And so the connection that we see between these activities and student agency and healing. So that in Valerie's case, the children that she chose to teach were the same age that she was when her parents divorced, when one of her parents was incarcerated and she went to live with her relatives. So she had an opportunity through this someday to create the kind of trust and support for others that she needed at their age. And it helped her to revisit and reclaim that point in her life. She talks about in this quote on this slide, I remembered what it was like to be scared to go into first grade. I wanted to be somebody that they can trust and turn to so that when they need you the most, you can be there for them. Some days give all of us more time so we can focus and think about more stuff. It gives your brain time to think and focus on something else, and it gives your brain time to refresh and get back all that focus that you need. So she's thinking about her own learning experience too, and like what she actually needs within the lived experience of learning in a given day. And then she says, what I like about some days is that you can trust that yours will come true. Let's say that you don't really like a teacher and you don't really trust them, and then they make your someday come true. And it's like, I can sort of trust these people. One of the things that the principal said to us about this is that some days make students feel wanted and whole and involved part of something bigger than themselves. It's building the happiness of students who come to school with something to look forward to. Mark, can I have the next slide? So I think we missed maybe one slide, Mark. Yeah, there we go. So the second practice that we put into effect was this idea of micro adventures. And this actually came from a class that Lynn Michael Brown taught at Colby, where she and her undergraduate students worked with focus groups of young people at the schools that we were partnered with to hear from them what they wanted out of their classroom experience. And one of the things that we heard over and over again was, we want to be outside. And the teachers were like, well, of course, they just want more recess time. But for students, it was really about getting outside, being able to move their bodies, refresh and reset in a different kind of way. And so out of that came this idea of micro adventures, which are small, curricularly relevant units that allow students to get outside. And there were really, the barriers to getting students outside more were really, sort of barriers that we were able to help the teachers get over. Like, I don't think I can facilitate a class outside because it'll be out of control. Well, we were able to supply tree staff, that kind of thing. But one of the things that we saw was that in this novel environment, through a whole body experience, students were able to have relational and emotional connections to one another and to teachers that were different than the kinds that they got in the classroom. Mark, can I have the next slide? So this is one of the things that we heard from a parent of a student who participated in the micro adventures. He has trouble at school just staying focused on basic things, and he gets frustrated, and he just shuts down. He liked the day that they built the shelters. That was one of the micro adventures that they did. He said that was awesome. And the teachers are like, we just can't get over how this kid can be such a leader outside of the classroom, where in the classroom, he's quiet and reserved and unsure of himself. Yeah, I feel like sometimes he's untapped on the potential that he has. Another parent said, our school has always been a homey place, but now it feels more electrified. So there was engagement both between home and school around these, and teachers who were able to see young people in a completely different light as they got out of the classroom. And then young people were able to have these whole body experiences. Next slide, Mark. So if you want to read more about this, obviously we write about it in the book, but Lynn Michael Brown and her student, Jenny, who did a lot of the work on this project, wrote about this for Phi Delta Kappan. Next slide. So one of the other practices that we did, particularly with the lower grades, came out of an innovation that had been done clinically by a child psychologist, Sue Carol Duffy, where she took sand trays in a clinical setting and allowed students to tell stories in the sand trays. And so the tree staff, in partnership with Sue, adapted this for teachers without clinical training in a whole group classroom setting. And one of the things that this did was it created opportunities for students to talk about their emotions within the context of the classroom. And it also opened avenues for the school to create more culturally responsive opportunities for students, which is something that the school struggled with in the context of the new immigrant population that they were working with. Next slide, Mark. So students would sit in a circle, and one of the facilitator would tell a story in the sand tray, and then students would be invited to either do a creative or artistic response to the story or tell a story in the sand tray themselves. Or students could be invited into the principal's office to tell stories in the sand tray to one another when they were experiencing conflict or other types of challenges. So this quote, there's one story about friends nurturing a tree into full growth and how that nurtures them ultimately, and how working together makes that happen. And it was nice because it was a pair and share. The instructions were share something that you heard the other person say. So there was an extra level of listening, and they did really well with that. So with the pre-K through second graders, this was an invitation to practice talking about emotions in a new way that really centered student experiences as opposed to like a predetermined cell curriculum. Next slide, Mark. So I won't touch on this too much, although we're happy to talk about it if folks have questions about it. But one of the most advanced or high investment opportunities for student voice was the creation of a student leadership team. So this was both the 5th and the 6th grade at these schools, helped us to actually do some of the research by administering and then analyzing the data from the school climate measures, and then presenting that to adults in the school, and identifying some of the priorities and changes that they would like to see coming out of that. They did a whole variety of other types of leadership activities that really focused on creating a welcoming environment for students of all gender identities, for students of all racial identities. And some of it was very counter-normative work for this school in this community. And to the point that, you know, sometimes it made teachers uncomfortable. And we actually saw a lot of opportunity in that, although navigating the challenges of that was certainly difficult at times. So I want to talk for just a second about some of the outcomes that we saw, and I'll do this briefly because I want to leave time for questions. Next slide, Mark. So one of the things that we saw was improved scores on the main educational assessment. So these are the scores from the Saybrook School. So in 2016, 2017, which predates our involvement with the school, you can see that in ELA and math, you had 40% of the students meeting or exceeding the standards, and then math, 29%. And by the time we get to 2019, which is the last time that we were able to access these scores because of COVID, we have 60% of students meeting the ELA standards and 54% meeting them in math. So big jumps over the time that we were involved in the school. We also administered, like I said, a school climate survey, both a pre and a post. So from 2018 to 2019, we see jumps. I'm invited to offer ideas and suggestions for improving my school. We see the discipline system at my school is fair. My teachers ask about my ideas and listen to what I say, went from 68% to 91%. I belong and matter in school, 64% to 91%. So big jumps around climate as well. One of the other things that we saw that we weren't expecting was that attendance improved. So from January 2018 through June 2019, chronic absenteeism declined to below the state average in tree schools. It declined 50% from its 2016 rates, which predate our involvement in the school. And among the students who also received mental health services, which is something that we offered on site, 55% showed improvement in attendance and 66% at Portside Elementary. So for us, the key learnings that came out of this multi-year engagement with the school was that seeing students as individuals with prior knowledge and present expertise is critical to creating safe, responsive, and equitable learning environments. And we go into many, many, many examples of this in the book. And that without a commitment to student voice and equity, trauma responsive practice actually is not possible, that kind of change at the systems level is impossible to create without these foci. So I think at this point, we'll stop and probably take questions. We have a little bit more about some days because we're really interested in seeing that practice spread in schools for next year. We have a piece coming out in Ed Week in a couple of weeks about how we think every student and every teacher in the country should have a Sunday next year. But I think just given the time, this is a good time to take questions.
But maybe just one word exactly about that, Kat, which is that these, we believe that all of these strategies, are very much in tune with the best practices around trauma responsive work, but we also think of them as universal strategies, right?
Yes.
That they are beneficial to all kids. In any given school and classroom, we may not know who has experienced adversity, stress, et cetera. So, in some cases you do, in some cases you don't, in many cases you don't. So we just think about this work as a kind of universal approach, trying to touch every kid in a school and every teacher, right? I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that point, Kat.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that I think teachers struggle with sometimes when trauma responsive practices come in is around being trauma detectives, right? And you don't need to know I think it's just safe to assume every student has experienced something difficult. And so how do we center their voice in this and give them choices around their own healing?
Yeah, great.
So I think we can shift to Q&A. Is that right? We good to go?
Yes.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat and that I can read out loud, but I'd also encourage other people who are participating, if they have questions, to ask them. And I have a question if we have time, but let's go with your questions first. So Jenny Wechter, what is one of the most successful pictures programs of healing-centered engagement you've seen in applied practice in schools, especially implemented at scale? Kat or Mark, do you want to take that on?
I don't know, Kat, you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, I think, well, I'll put it this way. I think that I think what our research points to, and I think that there are actually teachers out there doing this every single day, is that the quality of the relationships that you establish with the young people in your sphere of influence is going to have the greatest healing effect on their developments. That it's about, I mean, really what we're talking about is authentic relationships with young people that prioritize mutuality and co-regulation, right? And we're trying to give people vehicles through which to experience authentic mutuality and co-regulation. That's the point of these activities. And I think you can do that at scale. I mean, anybody, because everybody has the power to do that, as long as they have the right mindset. So it's not so much about interventions from my mind as it is about a mental paradigm shift. And that once you have the paradigm shift, then it's easy to do at scale.
And I think the some days is an example. I mean, it looks like, Jenny, you kind of wrote your question before Kat really got a chance to talk about some days. So I would say that's one really fairly simple example of sending the message to kids that they're important and they're being listened to. We have lots of examples of the positive impact of that on kids, and Kat talked about some of those. So, yeah.
Melissa Rivard's question: how did you analyze, make sense of the Gopro data you collected?
You want to take that one, Mark?
Well, yeah, we had an undergraduate research team working with those, and we were using, we had our coding system, and we were, looking for, we're using, so getting really into the specifics just for a second, Dana Mitra's work on student voice and her categories of agency, belonging, and competence, those three things, we were looking for evidence of those in the Gopro data and using in vivo and kind of coding around things. So we, COVID kind of interrupted our work with that research team. So as it interrupted a lot of things for lots of folks. So we didn't get too far down that road, but it was really just interesting also just to see some of the ways that these, primarily the micro adventures, looked from the kids' point of view. Just, it was fascinating. And it certainly provided it enriched our understanding of what was going on for the kids. So.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is just that we sliced the data in different ways. So we had a couple of kids that we really followed as intensive case studies. And so the Gopro data was part of that, of understanding those cases and understanding those students' experiences across context. So there was some narrative interpretation of that data that some of the undergraduate students wrote up as well.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna move on. I just want to tell you both that we have a bunch of questions, which is wonderful, but you might have to be a little, if we're going to get through a few, everyone's going to have to be a little brief.
Oh, okay.
Barbara's question: what does that mean to tell a story in the sand tray?
It's using things and sort of enacting. It's sort of, again, Kat said, it's kind of a play therapy, begins as a play therapy approach and then expands to an approach that any kid can use to tell their own stories in a sand tray, or all of these started with stories that were adapted from books, kids' books, using figurines and sort of so the kids could sort of physically see the story as it played out.
Good, thank you. The question from Brittany, it was a question that I had as well. You use an intensive approach here. Do you think it's possible from your research to only incorporate some of these interventions and still have an impact on school culture, which provide the highest impact? And I was going to ask you a similar question about scale and whether there are sort of current, Stephanie Jones used terms, kernels or key ingredients you think here that can be scaled widely. And Kat, I think you partly answered this by talking about the importance of relationships, but even in that domain, are there key things that you think you can do to move the paradigm shift you're describing? Are there along? Yeah.
Yeah, is it okay if I take this, Mark?
Oh, please, yeah.
Yeah, from my perspective, I think all of these are improvisations on a theme, right? And rather than interventions in the classical educational intervention sense. And I think that some days has the potential to be done at scale because it's so accessible and it's something that any school could implement. I think that the problem is when you stop at some days and you don't take the data that you get from that and then learn from it to actually make change using student voice. So one of the things that we talked about in the slides that we didn't get to is how do you then, as adults in the school, take the data from some days and say, what are we hearing about student experience? Whose new voices are we hearing? And then, so to me, I think that practice has the best chance at providing a high impact as long as it's done thoughtfully and not as a one-off. Because I think once you start to experience young people's desires as authentic and see them as experts on their own experience, then the mental shift happens that allows you to think more creatively in that space.
And there were a number of kids in the school because of as Kat said, one of the schools had a lot of new immigrants and other kids who were really kind of felt very much like outsiders in the school and
Yes.
and all of those things, alienated outsider, just didn't feel like they belonged. And with some days and some of these other things, they really, shifted the way they felt about the school and the way their parents felt about the school. But it does require, I think Kat's absolutely right, it does require staff to reflect on it and what they're learning and what they are hearing about kids and families and experiences that they might not have heard otherwise.
Thank you. Question from Barbara. I noticed there are recurring themes in some of the strategies. They use nature, play, creativity, and the arts, storytelling, fort making. Was the school already familiar with those strategies? And if not, how did they become familiar and comfortable facilitating?
I'll start this quickly. I mean, I would say they were, some teachers were more familiar than others, of course. Some of the typical creative arts work was happening in the school, but not widely. So it was a process of kind of snowballing. Some teachers got engaged and involved. They shared and expanded to other teachers. We did provide training opportunities for teachers to learn how to do moving stories, for examples. And so it was a mix, some familiarity, expanding the familiarity and comfort with both sort of formal PD and sort of informal colleagues sharing with one another. And it absolutely helped that we did, Kat mentioned this, we had in both schools, we had funding for a full-time, what we call a resource coach in the schools that facilitated a lot of this and a lot of the teacher learning and reflection. So that is I think a key part of what made this successful as well, is having somebody in the school who was tasked with this work.
Great. Kristen's question, do you have any additional resources you find informative about micro adventures?
I don't know, Kat, we want to
Well, I'd say the best place to start is probably Lynn and Jenny's article in Phi Delta Kappan, and then they cite a lot of sources for the, because microadventures comes from the outdoor education literature and then was adapted for this purpose. So.
And right. And so there are some outdoor education organizations in Maine that are doing this work, and probably similar, specifically this work, and there are probably similar organizations elsewhere doing this kind of outdoor education efforts.
Great, thank you. I'm worried I'm going to mispronounce the name, but I think it's Abimbola. I love the intervention. Would you expect this to be replicable in high schools? My colleagues would embrace any useful scale up in 9 to 12 grade levels.
Yeah.
We've talked about that quite a bit as students have graduated from these schools and gone on to their own high school experiences. But I think that's sort of beyond the scope of it. I'd love to be able to say that I think some days would work in a high school. I don't know, Mark, what do you think? It's hard to say. Depends on the high school.
Yeah, it would be really interesting. It would be really, really interesting to try some of these or other kinds of ways. There's, I think part of, just quickly, I think a lot of the student voice literature out there does focus on older kids and opportunities to get involved in leadership teams or, YPAR. YPAR is a major
or talk therapy.
Talk therapy, lots of things that are. So I think one of the things we were interested in doing was seeing if we could to work with literature out there on student voice efforts, other than again, Dana Mitra's work and a few others on sort of promoting student voice with younger kids. So I would say, any effort to really engage high school students in YPAR or talk to other kinds of, student government activist kind of work would be in line with the kind of things that we're talking about.
Great. I think we will have time for probably just one more question.
Okay.
It's a wonderful question. How would you say participation in this project has impacted school staff's conceptions of their role and relationships with students and their families and communities?
Kat, you've thought a lot about that. I would say, go for it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I would say that for some staff, we've seen a lot of movement around their, like, moving from a deficit perspective of families towards a more structurally based understanding of the challenges that families are working around. And to partner with the school with their students' learning, or not partner, as the case may be. I think that I wouldn't say that was universal. I think that for the staff who were able to shift their understanding of how families were engaging with the school, and this touches on a piece of the project that we didn't talk about in this talk, but do talk a bit about in the book, which is the provision of basic needs supports at the school site, and working with the tree coach to meet family needs. And really the tree coach just went above and beyond in this respect. I think that was very enlightening for a lot of teachers. I think COVID, it's the same effect that we saw during COVID, right? All of a sudden students are at home, the teachers are seeing what their home life experience is like, and it's changing their perception of the students. For some teachers, that confirmed their deeply held beliefs about family deficit. So I wouldn't say that it was that just exposure is transformative. I do think that seeing the students change in the classroom through the introduction of things like opportunities for them to share their home culture was very enlightening. But I think this is something that the staff really struggled with. And we actually talk about this a bit in the coda of the book at the end, to sort of talk about some of the limitations of the project and where we think the work needs to go next.
Yeah, so I mean, Barbara's question follows Bonnie's. I mean, it really was, there were challenges for sure. And so this is not just the book fully tells the story of not just, absolutely successful kind of happy ending. I mean, it's ongoing work, and no doubt that, as Kat said, COVID really threw a major wrench into things by way of stress, et cetera. So it's ongoing.
Well, I'm sorry to say that we've run out of time, but Kat and Mark, thank you so much. This was just terrifically interesting and helpful and heartening too, that you are doing this wonderful work. I really appreciate. I also really appreciate these very thoughtful questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
That people have raised. So I think we should probably wind this up. But any final words, Kat or Mark, before we go?
Yeah, great questions. Wish we could have more opportunity to talk. Looking forward for those opportunities in the future at some point.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all again. Thank you, Mayan, and be well. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.